All right, we're gonna just get through some of the technical stuff that I'm gonna pretend to understand
Sure.
while I look over here. So if you can talk,
One, two, three. Testing my sound. How's this sound?
perfect. I think it sounds good. And if not, then my sound guy will make you sound good.
You got a sound guy? Nice.
I got a guy.
Okay.
You know,
Good.
I saw your house yesterday on Periscope.
Oh, yes, the inside. Yes.
Yes, it was my very first Periscope.
Congratulations on your first watching of a Periscope.
Thank you. I felt. Do you do them often?
It's sort of sporadic. The beauty of it is you can just pick it up and do it whenever you want.
Well, that's what I saw. Like I was at the pool yesterday, and I had downloaded the app because I was watching yours. And I was like, I could just do this.
And the entire world will say, "Yeah." I mean, I've attended Trump rallies through somebody's phone.
Right.
I've gone on walks in Thailand through somebody's phone. It's very intimate in a weird way.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. This is my show is pretty new, so we're gonna have some rough edges. But it's the best part of what I do as a lawyer, even though it's not connected to my firm at all, because I get to read everything about my guests. So I've spent the past week kind of going through some of your, not just your Dilbert cartoons, but some of your writing. And I want to start with an interview you gave in the New York Times in 1997. So we're going to go way back. And I think that you gave a line then, and you had just left your job, right?
97, I'd left maybe 2 years earlier.
Okay. And you left to start to do Dilbert full time.
Yeah, I was doing Dilbert while I was working for many years, but then I went full time around 95.
So you talked about boss diversification in that article. You're looking at me like,
Right.
yeah, okay. And you said you thought that you could help with it's just diversification. It's just diversifying the portfolio of thoughts. I can definitely help there. Explain that.
Well, if you're talking about bosses, you just want to have as many bosses as possible. So that's my situation as a cartoonist. So for me to lose my job, 2,000 newspapers would have to simultaneously decide to fire me, plus licensees, plus book publishers. So the odds of me getting fired are low, unless I do something horrible. But if you have one boss, and that one boss doesn't like you, that's a big problem. So that's the typical situation. So I tell people to look for flexible schedules and boss diversification whenever they can.
But here you're talking about diversifying the portfolio of thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, just in general, the more thoughts, or the more ideas that people have experienced, the more tools they have. Because we're always trying to put our current experience on some kind of framework of ideas that we've seen before. We describe everything as, well, it's like this combined with this. So it's just the way we understand the world. So the more things you've seen, the smarter you are because you have more frames to put your current knowledge on.
So do you think that is that a conscious thing that you've done with your writing and with the comic? I mean, is it meant to kind of get people to think, or are they all 100% things that you believe?
Well, the blog in particular is idea dense, so I try to put as many controversial, interesting, innovative ideas as I can come up with, because the more you see, the better off you're going to be. I don't make a claim that any of my ideas are super good. In fact,
We're going to get to some of your less good, your less good ideas in a little bit.
Yeah, and I assume that most, if not all of them, are bad. But I like to use what I call, I learned this when I was working in Hollywood doing a Dilbert TV show for a while. It's called the bad idea. And people would often pitch the bad idea, let's say for a storyline for a script, not because they thought it was worth doing, but because it would inspire you to say, that doesn't work, just like you said it doesn't work. But if you change this one thing, it would. So you're basically birthing it with flaws and then letting people fix it. So ideas evolve.
And so that's kind of where your blog is at too. I mean, you throw an idea out there because you wrote a couple of books on God, right?
Well,
Thought
yeah,
experiments.
roughly. One is a thought experiment, and the other is fiction. So it's a version of God, yes.
And that I read a lot of the, started reading parts of it, and then I read a lot of people who have responded to this. Some of them are really harsh. They say, don't read this if you believe in God at all, because it will just tear the whole thing apart.
I actually put a warning on my book, God's Debris, that people under 14 probably shouldn't read it. And the reason is that it's written with the techniques of persuasion. Some of your listeners might know I'm a trained hypnotist. I learned hypnosis years ago. So when I wrote that book, God's Debris, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to write a book that uses hypnotic techniques to deepen the experience of reading it? And I wanted people to sort of feel the experience of learning the true nature of the universe in a fictional form, not a real form, and make that sort of a deep and profound feeling. So I used a lot of techniques to do that. So my version of God in those books is a fictional version, but it's designed to make it seem more compelling than maybe it should.
Well, it's obviously it worked on a number of people because it seemed to have shaken. I mean, you must have read those.
Yeah, it's a very polarizing book. So the reviews either say a lot of people say it's the best book they've ever read,
Right.
which is a weird thing to say because there are a lot of books in the world. But other people say, "My God, this is just the most terrible thing I've ever seen," and you should. I'm returning the book to the bookstore now for a full refund. People actually said that, and usually it's
After they've read it,
after they
it's
read it.
like
Yeah.
eating your dinner and then returning it and saying you don't like it.
Yeah, a little bit, but it was sort of a protest against its awfulness. But but that's actually a what I call a tell for persuasion. So the people who had the deeply negative feeling to it, they weren't just reading a book that didn't interest them, because that wouldn't give you any emotion at all. But rather, they were feeling persuaded in a way that affected their identity. If they'd built their entire life around a certain belief system, and they see a fictional book that questions it, and it's a good question, and it's
Right.
persuasive, and it's questioning, you've got to do something to get rid of that thought. So you're either going to have to change everything about yourself suddenly, which is painful and hard, or you have to dismiss the author as a hack and the ideas is crazy. So you'll see a lot of that.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think that you talk a little bit on your blog about in when you just said that, it kind of threw me off because I was thinking about the when you talk about terrorism and women on your blog, when you talk about how men become terrorists because of their lack of connection to women in the third world, in Islam. And it just made me think that, there's so much questioning of people's faith or religion that, we've got the Islamists have completely said that the West is, hateful and, wrong and morally distasteful, and they all need to die because of that. But that was my thought that went through. Have you ever thought about that? What's your take on the Islamists right now and what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, let me characterize what I did say about that a little with a little more context than your question had. When I talk about the men who don't have access to mating opportunities in the Middle East and how that might be an influence, I'm not indicating that's the one variable over
Right,
there.
of course.
All right, obviously, religion is a big part of it.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if the lack of air conditioning is part of it. I mean, not the big part,
Well, a lot of them
but
leave air conditioned homes in the West to go out there to fight, which I have air conditioning in Northern Virginia just fine.
well, I'm just saying
Right,
that people's physical condition does affect their mental condition, and the weather is part of that.
right.
Now, I'm saying the weather is probably a small part of it, but it's. I'm just saying there's lots of variables. But one of the biggest variables is if you have tons of males and they don't have a purpose in life, they're going to look for one. So they're kind of not attached to the basic purpose of life, which is finding a mate and reproducing. So if they don't have access to that, and they can't find meaning in the way that people usually do, which is family and spreading your genes and raising your kids, they're going to look for some other meaning. And ISIS, for example, gives them something to embrace.
And when you say that ISIS gives them something to embrace, do you think that ISIS is going to spread here to the U.S.? What do you think of their persuasion techniques?
Well, it must be pretty good. But they also have a situation that allows that. So again, if you've got lots of men who don't have jobs, don't have wives, and don't have any prospects for getting jobs or wives, they're going to look for something else. All right, they're not going to just shoot themselves in the head. They're going to look for something they can do that makes an impact, that makes them feel important, that makes them feel like they're contributing. So in that situation, it's easier to flip somebody. I think it would be very difficult to turn some suburban normal kid into an ISIS supporter. Obviously, with 300 million people in the country, some people are going to be persuaded of anything, but I don't think it's a huge problem in the United States.
So you don't think that they would be as persuasive with people, our young people in the West? Because that seems to be a fear that a lot of people have here in the U.S., that somehow...
I haven't heard that fear. People are worried that the youth in the United States will turn to ISIS?
Well, the Sharia law is going to come in, and that they're going to, come here and recruit people here in the United States. I mean, I've heard it. Maybe it's because I'm Muslim, so I will get that sort of response from people.
So that's more related to the immigration question than persuasion question. I mean, just numbers-wise, if immigration was tens of millions of people, then you'd have to ask yourself, how does that change the culture, and do you care? But if it's a trickle, like it is now, I don't see any way anything's going to change.
So immigration is a trickle?
If immigration is a trickle,
the way it is now, is that what? I just want to make sure is that what you said?
Yeah, it's. Okay. I would describe it as a trickle from the Islamic countries.
So when you talk about persuasion, all right, we're not talking about this in a vacuum, right?
Right.
So what do you mean by persuasion? How does one learn persuasion?
So persuasion, I use it as a big category that includes everything from advertising to hypnosis to brainwashing to every form of marketing. And there's tons of science now that didn't exist, 40 years ago about what is influential and what isn't. Somebody like Donald Trump has obviously studied all this. And by the way, negotiating is also influencing. And he literally wrote the book on negotiating, The Art of the Deal. So he says he understands psychology, and he demonstrates that on a fairly regular basis by the success he's had so far, managing people's emotional states in a way that's good for his election chances, at least up till now. He hasn't had a good week.
Yeah, it's been sort of rough for him. But I want to tie this back into the ISIS issue. So when you talk about, Sharia law or Muslims taking over or whatever else, and you say, well, that depends on what happens with immigration. And right now it's a trickle. So Muslims or people from Muslim countries or the powers that be would have to persuade the U.S. to open up the floodgates, as it were, first, and then we'd move on to the next category of persuasion.
I don't see anybody outside the country persuading the United States about immigration. I mean,
I don't think we're doing such a great job inside the country either.
Well, I think we're just a little deaf to other countries telling us what to do. I mean, and that would be true of most countries,
and
right?
It's not a bad thing.
It's a factor. We incorporate that in our thinking, but really, it's what does America think about immigration? So I guess, all I'm saying is the basic fact that if there is no immigration, then not much will change. If there's a little immigration, maybe a little will change. And if there's a lot of immigration, maybe a lot will change. So I'm just going by the numbers. I'm not really voicing an opinion there.
No, I know, but I'm talking specifically about the persuasion part of it, right? So when we talk about persuasion not being in a vacuum, right? So if I stand up and say, ISIS is going to infiltrate the US and take over our young people, we do have to move back a step to say, well, you'd have to get more immigrants here, right? I mean, that's kind of where we're going to, and they have to be specifically from those countries. So we'd have to kind of persuade people to say, oh, you know what, you should really let people from countries that are heavily, that are heavily indoctrinated into this Sharia law or serious Islamists to come into the U.S.
I think we're mixing topics a little bit. One is the topic of how much immigration changes the nature of the country, and do you care? Is that a change that you don't want or do want? And the other is what would it take to influence individual terrorists? Because you would only need a few to wreak, large havoc. So lots of times when you think people are having a debate, they're actually just talking about separate things really loudly.
Right.
So, yes, it wouldn't take much to persuade individuals in this country to switch, but there probably aren't going to be hundreds of them. There might be tens of them, in the best case scenario for ISIS, I guess.
Why did you start learning about hypnosis? What was it about it that intrigued you?
When I was a kid, my mother told the story about giving birth to my younger sister while my mother was under hypnosis. So my family doctor was a hypnotist, and she claims that she had no pain relievers, no medical pain relievers, and was awake and aware the entire birth, but she felt no pain. And I was deeply influenced by that, and so I thought when I became a young man in my 20s and ventured forth into the world, that would be sort of a superpower that I could layer on top of whatever else I was doing to make myself more effective.
And is it work?
It's a superpower.
It is? Are you hypnotizing me right now? Because I feel a little hypnotized.
People say that when they talk to me. So with hypnosis and persuasion in general, it's not something that you do so much as who you become. Right? So once you know how to communicate in a certain way, it's just how you communicate. So I'm persuasive by almost by nature now, but really it's a learned behavior.
Somebody had asked me to ask you, is it tough to convince people that you are a master persuader? And it seems like it's a silly sort of question, because if you're a master persuader, how hard could it be to convince someone that you're a master persuader? I mean, you think that if you just say that you're a master persuader, people believe you?
So one of the things that we learned in hypnosis class is that a big part of the process is the thing that happens before the hypnosis. So if somebody comes to your office and it's a proper office that looks like somebody spent a lot of money on, there's a diploma on the wall, you come out in your best suit.
We got all that.
Yeah, you're going to get a good result because people are just primed. Oh, this must be legitimate. And if you came out looking sketchy, you would get the opposite result. So, so a big part is what Trump has done, which he's established himself as influential because he wrote a book on negotiating, and then we watched him negotiate with the Republican Party successfully. We watched him dominate that party. We watched him dominate the news networks and dominate voters in a way because he got somebody to vote for him. So he's demonstrated it, and in a way that you can see. All right, but it still took. I swear, if it hadn't been for me blogging and Mike Cernovich and a few other people talking about his actual technique, his persuasive technique, I don't think the country would have understood. I think they would have just said, hey, I guess he picked the right topics and he's got a bunch of racists supporting him and there must be a lot of them.
But what about you? How do people believe that you're a master persuader?
Well, they probably do now, but not 6 months ago. Partly the reason that I predicted Trump's rise.
You and Howard Stern.
Well, for other reasons. The reason I predicted it, as opposed to simply explaining it as it happened, is that anybody can explain something after the fact. You can take 10 different theories of why Trump did well and say, well, after the fact, it's obvious he did because of these facts. But very few people could predict it. So I thought, well, if I predict him and I get it right, and I was pretty sure I would, people will understand that I have a command of these same tools. because all I'm really doing, I'm not even looking at his politics. I'm just looking at his tools. And he uses persuasion tools very well. And I figured if people saw that I could identify them and explain them, they would assume that I possess them as well, which is true.
Has it increased your book sales?
My book is in a category of the sort of in the self-help category, so it's a small category. But yes, it sits usually in the top 3 of that category.
And your current talks on Trump and your prediction has helped.
Well, my blog traffic is way up.
Right.
And I mentioned the book in the blog, so that probably does help, yes. But in terms of actual money, it hasn't made any difference at all, because authors like me get advances.
Right.
So I haven't sold through the advance. So Trump has made me no money on books.
He's made you no money. But you just increased the sales. Like you got more numbers coming in and, kind of increased your profile, as it were, right? So speaking of money, you have a very famous quote, I think, if I can call it a quote, about investing, right? So you made money from Dilbert, and you said you invested half of it with professionals, and the other half you did yourself, and they invested in WorldCom and Enron and all of that, right? And then, so you obviously fared better than the professionals.
I did, but only because I wasn't using my own judgment. I was buying index funds and mutual funds, which I wouldn't buy anymore because of the fees. But yeah, the more they actively traded with their intelligence, the worse I did.
But they persuaded you that they knew what they were doing? Or did you listen to other people? Or, how do you...
No, there's a reason that I kept half of the money to myself. And the reason is they did not persuade me that they could do better with my money. They did persuade me, however, that their name was not Scott Adams. And so part of my diversification process is I don't let myself manage all of my own money because I could go off the deep end too. So I thought, well, at a minimum, no matter how stupid I am, half of my money will be managed by professionals. Mm-hmm. Now, as it turns out, the reverse happened, but diversification allows for that, right? The whole point of diversifying is you don't know which thing is going to break. You just have to have something ready in case it does.
So in the and I liked that. But really, I think that the interesting thing was when you talk about how they invested in these in WorldCom and Enron. It's like, did they have some inside scoop into how bad this was going to be, or was that?
We cut out a little bit, but I think you were mentioning the bad companies that they invested.
Right.
Well, at the time I didn't know any better. So the claim was that they had not insider, but they had extra information because they would do deep research on these companies. So far more than you could find out by reading publications and stuff. They would go talk to CEOs and really dig in. I'm pretty sure none of that happened.
Right. That was actually my question. We cut out, but that was it.
Yeah, and if it did happen, who were they talking to? The CEO, who was a professional liar?
Right.
How in the world is that going to help?
So I want to go back to this 1997, and I have to. My glasses are not that great still, so I'm holding out my yellow pad. The 1997 interview.
You're such a lawyer with your yellow pad.
I know. Isn't that
Come
funny?
on.
I have my yellow pad.
Join us in this century.
I have some notes on my computer, but it's hard for me to toggle. It's ridiculous. We're going to do a tech segment on the show where somebody's actually going to try to teach me how to use my Mac. It's going to be, I think, very... Oh, I have on here, feminists hate you. We're going to get to that in a second, too. In 1997, the New York Times says your Dilbert site is one of the only websites making money.
Well, that was in 1997, right?
Right, but how did you know that it was going to do this? That's...
Well, so my day job, while I was doing Dilbert at the same time, was working at Pacific Bell, the local phone company at the time. And specifically, I worked in a lab where we were the first ones to see the internet. At least,
Right.
so we were playing with the internet, then called the World Wide Web, before anybody had even heard those words. There was no such thing as a browser. And I saw firsthand how quickly people got excited about it. When we would do demos, people would look at this internet thing that literally did one thing. At the time, you could only look at some pictures from the Smithsonian, and then there was one other site that had some dinosaurs from somewhere else that didn't usually work. So there was one website in the whole world, and people came out of their chairs with excitement that they could push a button here and something at a distance would present them with information. And I thought, oh my God, this internet thing is going to be huge. So long before the general public was keen to its potential, it was obvious to me that it was big. And I had one advantage that other cartoonists didn't have, besides that special knowledge about this technology. I was failing. So Dilbert at the time just wasn't doing as well as it should.
By the way, I went through the earlier Dilberts today, like 1995, 1997. I had tears running down. I kept retweeting them, tears running down my face from laughing. And I remember
Well, thank you.
some of them. And I just couldn't, because I think it was so fresh and new. It was just a really neat concept. But go on, you were saying it wasn't
Okay.
making money.
Well, so at the time, it wasn't growing at a rate that looked good for its future. So I could take some chances that an established cartoonist would not. And at the time, it seemed like a big chance to put your content for free on the internet, especially when you're trying to sell it simultaneously to newspapers who are competing with the internet. So what are the newspapers going to say when you say, here's your content, please pay us? Oh, it's also free for everybody on the internet.
Right.
So the entire world can get it free. So nobody would have taken that kind of risk with an established property. You don't do that with Snoopy on day one or Peanuts. But I could do it. So I took that risk. It turns out that it wasn't a risk. Newspapers were happy that readers were seeing it on the internet and then liking it, and then they would like it in the newspapers. So it was all sort of symbiotic. But I was able to move first because I had a different risk profile than the people who, and also greater knowledge about that specific technology.
So it was helpful that you didn't have an established brand at that point.
It helped a lot. Yeah. Success is very restricting.
Right. Right. When I get there, I'll let you know, and we can have a debate about that, whether
Yeah.
that's the case. So, in that, I just have to ask you this question. You have 6 rules for humor, right? There's 6 categories of humor, like something that makes something funny.
Six dimensions.
Six
yes.
dimensions, right? The cute, the bizarre, the mean, the naughty, the clever, the recognizable. But then you give an example, and I don't understand it. I really don't. You have to explain it. It's deader than a shrunken head in a hacky sack competition. I don't know why that's funny, and apparently it hits 2 or 3 out of those 6, and I don't get it.
Well, so first of all, it's bizarre. Right?
Right?
It's a bizarre thing. That's one of the dimensions. Second of all, it's mean. Something bad happened to somebody. Obviously, somebody had a living head, and now it's a shrunken little
Now
head
it's
that's being used
funnier.
as a sack. And then the clever part is anytime you're using something in a way it's not intended. In this case, you're using a shrunken head as a hacky sack. So it has all those dimensions. Now, obviously, humor is subjective, right? So the fact that you don't think it's funny has nothing to do with whether it is funny to other people.
Right.
Those things are
The
not
New York
related.
I mean, but you picked it out to put in the New York Times, so I thought, I'm just not, there's something to this that I don't.
Generally, the dimension of mean, where something bad is happening to people, that doesn't work for everybody.
Right.
That's a little less universal, and it might skew male.
I
And
think that, so my kids tell your mama jokes. And
right,
maybe that's wrong, but I love the your mama's so fat jokes. Those are really funny. Like your mama's so fat, she went on a diet and cured world hunger. I think that's really funny. And the your mama's so stupid jokes. But the your mama's so poor jokes, those make me feel bad. I don't like those. Stupid and
yeah,
fat, I can handle. Poor,
Yeah, well, I'm not too comfortable with fat, but
Right. I think they're really funny. It's terrible.
by the way, 75% of my readers have a weight problem, so I learned long ago that weight is an issue that I stay away from.
Well, then we won't discuss. We won't talk about whether you think they're funny. I think, and I probably, and even if I don't, I wouldn't, out in public, although I just have in public said I think they're funny. It's not I don't have a visceral distaste for it the way I do with the poor
Right.
issue. I know that it's not appropriate, but then I have to turn around and laugh.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a professional humorist, and there are still things that other humorists say that I just shake my head and go, too far. I mean, not
Like
very
who?
often, but it's not because the topic is too far. It's because it just hit me personally.
Right.
It was just something I've experienced. Like, ooh, that's a
Right.
real problem. That's not funny.
Right. So who do you admire as far as humorists go? Who are some of your
Oh, well, in the cartoon
mentors?
world, I was mostly influenced by Peanuts as a young person. As an adult, I like a lot of the stand-up comedians, Brian Reagan, for
Hmm.
example, Seinfeld. I'm not good at remembering names of comedians, but probably a dozen that I like a lot.
Somebody asked you on your Periscope yesterday if you liked Garfield, and you said yes. It's one of the greats, right?
Yeah, Garfield is one of the great comics designed for the audience that it was intended for. And it's not intended for every person in the world. It skews young and female, and it's been gigantic for decades. So you'd have to say it's a huge success artistically.
What about that Kathy cartoon? Do you like that one?
Well, first of all, I know Kathy Guys White, and I'm kind to all cartoonists. Obviously, that one is not targeted at men, but I appreciate it for how well it did and how much it was loved by its target
Yeah.
market.
And there's one more. We're gonna move fast forward to the present day soon. But you said I'm not happy on vacation, and yesterday you actually said you hate traveling on your
Yeah.
Periscope. You said you hate traveling. In those rare times when I have 3 hours with no work to do, I'm terribly uncomfortable. That is my happy zone, working at full capacity. Is that still true?
Well, being useful at full capacity, it's not all just work for money anymore. I've tried to do things that are somehow helpful to the world. So my How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big book is obviously a for money project. I sell the book to make money, but it's written primarily for the benefit of the reader. So it's something that I think can help people make their life better. So that's the sort of thing that motivates me in the morning. I've already made the money that I need. I just don't need any more for the
Right.
rest of my life. So every day I get up and work, it's for someone else's benefit by definition, because I'm not going to spend that money.
Right. I mean, I think that in one of your blog posts that we're going to talk about in a minute, you say that if I told you what my Tuesday morning looks like, you would cry. And then I read your
I
1997 article about how you're just working all the time. And I was like, I think that things may have, I mean, of course they would have changed from 1997 until now.
Yeah, so I've figured out ways to reduce the crushing burden of my workload. But I'm probably doing more useful things now. I'm just spending fewer hours doing.
So you have, I just read to you, I wrote in my notes, feminists hate you.
Was that a question?
I don't know, was it? Can you read my mind? Why don't you tell me if it was a question?
Well, what would be an example
So
of
you
some?
wrote a blog post, and I haven't been able to read it because you deleted it. And I can only get excerpts of it from feminist websites. So Feminist is one, and the Mary Sue. So you wrote a blog post about how arguing, I'm only taking it
Out of
out of
context?
context because that's the only way that I got it. It's not how
Well,
I
but,
read.
well, let me before you even say it, because this is part of persuasion, right? So whatever you hear first will set the frame for what
Oh,
comes.
oh,
So let me tell you, and this is just accurate.
uh-huh.
Before you say your quote that makes me look terrible, you should know that the context was a blog I wrote making fun of men.
Right. So this is the thing. When I said that the only place I could get this was from feminists' websites.
Okay,
That was it.
so is a blog making fun of men? Go on.
Right. So just to fill in the entire story, you had posted, and again, I only have the information from these websites, asking your readers to give a topic, right, of what you should write about. And they said, write about men's rights. So you wrote about how, and I have to tell you, some of it is really funny. They're like, oh, Scott Adams hates consent, which I mean, I tried to find out where you said you hated consent.
Nowhere.
Right. Well, of course you didn't. But so it says that men have to open doors. They open doors for women. They get the women's order gets taken first. They're served first. If you go home, they have to be the designated driver. Always true. Very, very good point. Men are the designated driver. When you go home, the woman controls whether or not there's any sexual interaction.
Because of consent, right?
Well, of course. And
Right.
then you talk about women making 80 cents to the dollar and how you won't argue. And I'm going to start with this. I agree with your point on this. Okay. And women all over the world are going to kill me. Although they don't really say much to me, which is fine too. But that arguing with them is like arguing with a 4-year-old about candy or a mentally retarded. And again, I'm paraphrasing.
Hold on.
Go ahead.
That's inaccurate. That's inaccurate.
Okay, can you? I don't have it in front of me, but tell me exactly what it says.
I said arguing about the one point that you agree with me on about the
Wage gap.
The wage gap. I said arguing about that with a woman who believes the wage gap is real.
It's real, right?
You never win that argument in the history of time.
Right.
No man has ever said to a woman,
And you pick your battles,
like everybody does.
right?
But let me ask you this, a fair question. So if you agree with me, and I think people have looked into it, all agree, even feminists agree at this point, that there is no identifiable wage gap if you dig down to all the variables and you find out what's going on. There might be some unexplained part that might be discrimination, but the numbers don't prove that, right?
Sure.
There's just there's a little noise in the numbers. But if you were to have you ever had the experience where you debated somebody who believed there's the wage gap of, say, 20 cents on a dollar or whatever? Have you ever changed their minds?
No, and I totally think that your point that you made with the candy and whatever else, I think it's accurate. I think I think you can make anything sound bad depending on your perspective, right? So
Right.
you could take that and say, oh, he's comparing women to retarded people or children.
Hold on. Only the way you just did.
Well, but I did.
But did you just compare women to retarded
No,
children?
that's what. No. That's
No. Hold on. I'm doing to you what they did to me, so that you can see it in action.
It's very frustrating.
No, hold on. You used them in the same sentence.
Right. Exactly.
That's a comparison.
Exactly.
Right.
Right.
So you're as guilty in exactly the same way as I was.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree with you. I mean, I find that generally speaking, you do have to pick your battles. I have 2 8-year-old boys. I have to pick my battles. I mean, it's just, and the same with arguing about people about politics, right? Donald Trump, for example. I don't love Donald Trump. I don't. I'm not a fan. I'm not a supporter. I also can see kind of where he comes from. I have friends. Mike Cernovich is a good friend of mine. So we don't argue Trump. Right? We don't. We talk about all sorts of other things. We do talk about Trump. We talk about the pros and cons, but you're not going to change these women's minds. And that's why I started this by saying, I've only gotten this from feminist websites. I can't find this article anywhere else.
Let me circle back to a key point here. Remember that the article we're talking about, I said a bunch of offensive things about men that I thought were funny, but terribly offensive. Then I said in the same article some offensive things, the one you mentioned, meaning that it rubs people the wrong way when they hear it. They just go, I have a visceral reaction to the way you chose your words. I don't disagree with the point. In fact, no feminist has ever disagreed with the point. They've only disagreed with the way I worded it. So I plead guilty to being offensive because that article was written to be offensive. It was designed to be offensive to both men and women because it was funny to be terribly offensive in this one blog post. Now, did I learn my lesson that the public does not understand this type of humor, especially when pieces are taken out of context? Yes, I did learn my lesson, and I would be smarter in the future about it.
What
But
do you mean? What would you do in the future?
I just wouldn't write on that topic because there's some topics which are guaranteed to be pulled out of context.
Oh, that's a shame.
Free speech is not so free.
Because every time I saw a link to it, I would click on it, hoping I would be able to read the actual words instead of the interpretation.
But I think the reason you're not seeing the link is just because the blog moved. I don't because
So it's an
I'm
old
not,
link.
well, I know I deleted it at one point, but I'm pretty sure either somebody else put it up. So
I'll try to find it.
it was all over the internet.
Yeah,
It's not worth finding, believe me.
not one of your best.
Yeah, I mean, I deleted it at one point, um, but I may have reinstated it at one point, and then the blog moved to a different URL. So I don't know the history of it, but you should be able to find it.
But yeah, the feminists said you hated consent. I mean, I think you have to go out of your way to formulate that opinion. What did you do to them?
Well, first of all, does anybody have the opinion that like rape's a good idea and that men ought to be able to do it? I mean, the accusation was so ludicrous on its surface, but that's exactly what made it spread. Because if you said, "Hey, this this dog bit a person," people say, "Yeah, that's what dogs do." But if you say this dog, stuck a rocket up his ass and flew around the moon, people are like, "I got to see that dog." So when the crazies at Jezebel and other places started saying that I was some convoluted argument that because I said X, then I must really mean Y in my secret mind, people thought, "My God, that's outrageous," and it just became a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was a thing, and I wanted to but that's what it says. It says feminists hate you.
There probably is not any issue that well-informed feminists and I disagree on. At least I'm not aware of one.
As a well-informed feminist, although I've been told that I'm not a feminist, by I guess some men who know better than me.
Explain it.
Yeah. So then you wrote two other blog. I mean, you write a lot of blog posts, right?
Yeah, a few a week.
A few a week, about all sorts of really interesting topics. So, get rid of marriage, right? Marriage, civilization's biggest mistake. So is this part of your diversifying the portfolio of thought, or is it something you really mean?
Well, in that case, I really mean it. I don't think that humans are going to get rid of marriage anytime soon. But if you were to make a list of all the problems in the world, it's pretty easy to make an argument that you could solve most of them by getting rid of marriage and replacing it with some other kind of system, which might be different for each individual, right? There's probably not one solution for everybody. But take for instance, climate change, right? Putting people, a family in a house and saying, okay, you all have to have your own car when you're old enough to drive and your own room. And, basically it's the most inefficient way to organize a small group of people is by a family. So if you did away with that, and I'm not saying you should all become communists, but I'm just comparing it to the system, you would have a much more energy efficient system. You'd have people sharing cars, for example, and
We do away with the nuclear family, right, and do it more the way that they do in the East.
Yeah, and again, I'm not suggesting we do that because people just flip out and go crazy. I'm just saying if you compare it, global climate change would be less of a problem because you'd use far less energy, right? If you look at the problems of divorce and what that does to kids, that goes away if you get rid of marriage, and happiness in general. I mean, if you take any two humans in the modern world and say, "Hey, do you guys like each other?" They probably say, "Yeah, I do. We get along great." If you wanted to make them hate each other, the thing you would do is you say, "All right, now you have to live together and make all your decisions together, even though you don't like the same things at the same time."
I actually tweeted that line that you had in one of your articles earlier today because I think that's very true. You talk a lot about having to compromise.
Well, yeah. So you have two people who have very distinct and varied preferences, trying to marry it with somebody else. And even if you find somebody who likes the same stuff you like,
Square dancing.
well, yeah, in the old days, square dancing was sort of the common denominator. If you both like square dancing, you had everything in common. You're done. But today, you like quilting, and I like race cars, and and I like specialty beers or something. Our interests are just so diverse that finding one mate who has enough of them is hard. But then, even if you did, imagine finding somebody who wants to do it at the same time you do. Like I couldn't even find my mate and I were never hungry at the same time.
Right.
So one of us either had to eat twice that day, once went hungry and once socially, or not eat or something. And we were never like the same temperature. So we couldn't even be in the house at the same temperature. And I'm talking about a big difference. I like it at 68.
Right.
She liked it at 76. Right. You don't really compromise between those two things. That's too big a difference.
I always say that the problem with relationship is the questions. You get asked a lot of questions like, "Are you coming back?" I just like what?
I'll tell you,
hopefully, maybe I don't know. Let's see how I feel. That's me.
My biggest pet peeve about relationships was when my spouse would be going somewhere. I'd say, "Woo, I've got the house to myself. I can do whatever I want." And as she drives away, she calls on her cell phone and tells me the 6 things that just need to be done before she gets back. And I'm like, I hate being married.
Right.
I
You
hate
love the person, but the marriage part is.
Weirdly, I never had a problem with the person. We
Right.
always got along great. In fact, she just walked out a minute ago. I see her all the time. She only moved a block away.
Right.
So we're best friends. But
And did the divorce help that relationship? Did it
oh
strengthen it?
God, oh God, yes, it's the best it's ever been.